Captain Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck of the UES Liberty and watched Nexus Prime grow larger on the viewscreen. The massive space station looked like a metallic flower blooming in the darkness of space with its 12 docking arms, stretching out to welcome ships from across the galaxy. Each arm was designed for a different species, and Jake could see the familiar shapes of Drachneri. Warships docked alongside the elegant curved vessels of the Velthan Collective. This was his 10th trip to Nexus Prime as security escort for Ambassador Lisa Brooks, but something felt different this time. The usual chatter on the communication channel seemed more tense, and the docking controller's voice carried an edge that Jake had never heard before. Even the station's lights seemed dimmer somehow, as if the very heart of galactic civilization was growing tired. "Captain Morrison to the bridge, please," came the announcement over the ship's intercom. Jake made his way through the corridors of the Liberty, noting how his crew members seemed more alert than usual. Everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The galaxy was holding its breath. On the bridge, Ambassador Brooks was reviewing her notes for what she didn't know would be humanity's final appearance at the Galactic Council. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who had spent 30 years learning to speak the languages and understand the customs of species that had evolved on worlds humans could barely imagine. Today she wore her formal diplomatic uniform with the golden Earth insignia that had become a symbol of peace throughout the galaxy. "Ambassador, the Drachneri delegation has already arrived," reported Lieutenant Ben Carter from the communications station. "They're requesting an immediate private meeting before the council session begins." Brooks looked up from her tablet and frowned. Private meetings before council sessions were not unusual, but the Drachneri rarely requested them. They preferred to make their points loudly and publicly where everyone could witness their strength. "Did they say what this was about, the mining rights dispute in the Omega sector?" Carter replied. "But they're calling it something else now. They're calling it the final territorial question." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. In his experience, when warrior species like the Drachneri started using phrases like "final question," it usually meant they were preparing for war. He caught Brooks' eye and saw that she understood the implications too. The docking procedure went smoothly enough, but Jake noticed that the usual friendly greetings from station personnel were replaced by formal nods and quick glances. The Nexus Prime security team that met them at the airlock was larger than usual, and their weapons were clearly visible. Something had changed in the 6 months since their last visit, Ambassador? Brooks led her small delegation through the familiar corridors of the station toward the council chambers. Jake walked slightly behind her with 2 other security officers, while Dr. Sarah Davis, the team's xenopsychologist, made notes on her tablet about the behavioral changes she was observing in the various species they passed. "The Mercanti traders are avoiding eye contact with us," Davis whispered to Brooks. "That's new. They usually try to engage us in conversation about trade opportunities." "I noticed that too," Brooks replied quietly. "And did you see how the Velthan scholars turned away when we passed? They're usually eager to share their latest research findings with us." They reached the council chambers 30 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, but found that most of the other delegations were already there. The great circular room, with its 12 seats arranged around a central speaking platform, had been humanity's second home for 2 centuries. Earth's chair sat between the Velthan and Mercanti, positions a place of honor that reflected humanity's role as the primary mediator in galactic disputes. "Counselor." The Exver of the Drachneri Empire rose as soon as Brooks entered the chamber. He was a massive reptilian figure with scarred hide and burning yellow eyes that spoke of countless battles. His voice carried across the chamber like thunder when he spoke. "Ambassador Brooks, we must speak privately before this session begins." Brooks nodded and followed the Exver to one of the small meeting rooms adjacent to the main chamber. Jake positioned himself outside the door while the 2 diplomats talked. Through the thin walls he could hear the Exver's voice growing louder and more aggressive, while Brooks maintained her calm diplomatic tone. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Brooks' face was pale but composed. The Exver looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. Jake had seen that expression before on Draknari faces, and it never meant anything good. The council session began with the traditional greeting in the ancient, neutral language that had been developed specifically for interspecies communication. Councillor Zarathil of the Velthan Collective presented the official complaint about Draknari military movements in the Omega sector. The dispute itself was nothing new. Both species claimed mining rights to several asteroid fields rich in quantum crystals that were essential for faster-than-light travel. What was new was the tone of the debate. Instead of presenting logical arguments and evidence, both sides seemed more interested in making accusations and assigning blame. The Mercanti tried to mediate as they often did when trade routes were threatened, but their suggestions were ignored. The smaller species that usually looked to humanity for guidance sat silent in their chairs. Brooks rose to speak, and the chamber fell quiet. For 200 years, human voices had been the ones that found compromise where none seemed possible. Human diplomats had prevented 17 wars and negotiated countless trade agreements that brought prosperity to species across the galaxy. Honored counselors, Brooks began in her clear, steady voice, the Omega sector dispute can be resolved through the standard arbitration process. Both the Draknari Empire and the Velthan Collective have legitimate interests in the region. One proposed we establish a joint mining operation with profits shared according to the Kepler Accords of 2387. That's when Nexver stood up and everything changed forever. No more human interference, the Draknari roared. For too long we have allowed your species to dictate terms to us. You claim to be neutral, but you always favor the weak over the strong. You have made the galaxy soft and dependent. A shocked silence fell over the chamber. In 2 centuries of galactic politics, no species had ever directly challenged humanity's role as mediator. Brooks remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in a pose Jake had seen her use when she was thinking quickly. Councillor Thexver, she said calmly, humanity has never sought to dictate terms to anyone. We have only tried to find solutions that serve the interests of all parties. That is exactly the problem, Thexver shot back. Your solutions serve everyone, which means they serve no one completely. The strong should take what they can take, and the weak should accept what they must accept. That is the natural order, Zarathil. Of the Velthans rose to respond, but her words were drowned out as other counselors began speaking at once. The chamber erupted into chaos as species that had coexisted peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of fundamental questions about power and justice. Brooks tried to restore order, but for the first time in anyone's memory, her voice was ignored. The counselors were too busy arguing among themselves to listen to human reason. Jake watched from the gallery as 2 centuries of careful diplomatic work began to unravel in real time. Then came the moment that changed everything. Councillor Zarathil called for a formal vote on a motion that Jake couldn't quite believe he was hearing. The motion was to place all human diplomatic personnel under species oversight, which meant that humanity would no longer be trusted to mediate disputes without supervision from other species. The vote was 8 in favor and 4 against, with humanity abstaining. Jake watched Brooks' face as the result was announced and saw something he had never seen before in 30 years of knowing her. He saw defeat. Brooks stood slowly and looked around the chamber at species she had served faithfully for decades. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. For 200 years, humanity has served as mediator, peacekeeper, and voice of reason in this council. We have prevented 17 wars, negotiated 43 trade agreements, and saved countless lives through our diplomatic efforts. If the Galactic Council no longer values our contribution, then we withdraw our participation, effective immediately. She turned and walked toward the exit. Jake and the rest of the human delegation followed. Behind them, the chamber erupted into shouting as the full implications of what had just happened began to sink in. By the time they reached the Liberty, urgent messages were already coming in from human diplomatic stations across the galaxy. Ambassador Brooks had transmitted a single coded message to Earth, and within hours every human diplomat, trader, and peacekeeper would receive the same order: return to human space. Diplomatic withdrawal is now in effect. As the Liberty pulled away from Nexus Prime, Jake looked back at the station that had been the center of galactic civilization for over 3 centuries. He wondered if he would ever see it again and whether it would still be standing when he did. The galaxy was about to learn what peace looked like without humanity to maintain it. Admiral Connor Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Defender and watched another alien ship turn away from the border of human space. This was the 10th vessel this week that had tried to enter human territory, and like all the others, it had been politely but firmly refused entry. The ship was a mercanti trader that had probably been carrying goods between human and alien worlds for decades, but those days were over now. 6 months had passed since Ambassador Brooks had walked out of the Galactic Council, and the effects were already becoming visible throughout the galaxy. The withdrawal had been swift and complete. Every human diplomatic station had been evacuated, every trade post had been closed, and every peacekeeping vessel had returned to human space. The galaxy that had relied on human mediation for 2 centuries was now on its own. "Admiral, another message from the Velfin Collective," reported Commander Amy Foster from the communications station. "They're requesting permission to send a diplomatic vessel to Earth for emergency negotiations." Hayes shook his head without looking away from the view screen. "Same response as always, Commander. All diplomatic contact must go through official channels, and those channels are currently closed for review." The official language was polite, but everyone understood what it really meant. Humanity was done talking. After being told their services were no longer wanted, they had simply taken the galaxy at its word and left. The border fleet that Hayes commanded was under strict orders to allow no alien vessels into human space, except in cases of genuine medical emergency. Down on Earth, Dr. Patricia Wells was working late in her office at the Institute for Xenopsychology. The room was filled with files and data tablets containing decades of research on alien behavior patterns and cultural practices. All of that knowledge was now essentially useless since humanity no longer dealt with alien species, but Wells couldn't bring herself to stop studying the reports that continued to filter in from the border regions. The latest intelligence briefings painted a disturbing picture. The Drachnary Empire had moved quickly to claim the disputed Omega sector as soon as human mediators were no longer available to negotiate a compromise. They had expected the Velfin Collective to file a formal protest and request arbitration as they had done for decades. Instead, the Velfins had responded with something nobody had seen them use before. Wells pulled up the classified report on her screen and read it again, even though she had already memorized every word. The Velfins had deployed quantum disruption weapons against the Drachnary mining stations in the Omega sector. The technology had been theoretical for years, but no one had ever used it because human diplomats had always found peaceful solutions before things reached that point. The quantum disruption had torn apart 3 Drachnary stations at the molecular level, killing over 50,000 Drachnary workers in minutes. The Drachnary response had been immediate and brutal. They had launched a full military assault on Velfin border worlds using biological weapons that targeted Velfin physiology specifically. Wells closed the file and rubbed her tired eyes. She had spent 30 years studying alien psychology, and she understood what was happening. The species that had come to depend on human mediation had never learned to compromise on their own. They had gotten used to having humans solve their problems and find middle ground between conflicting interests. Without that safety net, they were reverting to their basic instincts. On the other side of human space, Captain Ben Foster was dealing with the economic consequences of the withdrawal. His cargo vessel, New Hope, had been running trade routes between human and alien worlds for 15 years, but now those routes were closed. Instead of carrying exotic alien goods, he was helping to relocate human colonists from border worlds that were no longer considered safe. The trade networks that had connected dozens of species across the galaxy were collapsing without human intermediaries to facilitate communication and resolve disputes. The Mercanti Consortium had built their entire economy around interspecies trade, but they were discovering that they couldn't navigate the complex cultural requirements of different species without human translators who understood not just language, but context and meaning. Foster's latest cargo had been refugees from the human colony on Kepler Prime. The colonists had been forced to evacuate when fighting broke out between local alien factions, who could no longer agree on anything without human arbitrators to help them find common ground. 3 different species had claimed jurisdiction over the same planetary system, and without human diplomats to sort out the legal complexities, they had simply started shooting at each other back on Earth. President Kate Sullivan was facing increasing pressure from various political factions. Some wanted to return to galactic politics and try to repair the damage that was being done. Others argued that humanity should expand its isolation and focus entirely on its own development without any alien contact at all. The president sat in her office reviewing the latest reports from the intelligence services. The news was getting worse every day. The Zephyrians and the aquatic Delans had gone to war over water rights to a shared star system. The conflict had started over something trivial and should have been resolved in a few days with human mediation, but without that option available, it had dragged on for months and was now threatening to expand into neighboring systems. Dr. Wells had been brought in to advise the president on the psychological implications of the withdrawal. She explained that the alien species hadn't just become dependent on human diplomatic skills, but had actually lost the ability to compromise effectively on their own. For 2 centuries we solved their problems for them, Wells told the president. During their private meeting, we taught them that there was always a human solution to every conflict. They never learned to find middle ground between their different viewpoints because they always knew we would do it for them. So what happens now? President Sullivan asked. They're acting like children whose parents have left them alone for the first time, Wells replied. They're testing boundaries, fighting over resources, and generally behaving badly because they don't know how to regulate their own behavior anymore. The psychological dependency ran deeper than anyone had realized. Human diplomats hadn't just been mediators, they had been the galaxy's emotional regulation system. They had provided the calm, rational voice that helped species step back from their worst impulses and find peaceful solutions to their conflicts. The first minor war had broken out exactly as Wells had predicted. The Zephyrians were a proud species that valued honor above everything else, while the Delans were practical beings who cared only about results. Under normal circumstances, human diplomats would have found a way to satisfy both species' psychological needs while solving the underlying resource dispute. Instead, the war had dragged on for 6 months and showed no signs of ending. Both species were pouring resources into a conflict that was devastating their economies and killing thousands of their people over something that could have been resolved with a simple water-sharing agreement. The most disturbing reports were coming from the border monitoring stations. Captain Tony Reed of the Observation Post Watchdog Alpha was tracking communications between various alien factions, and the intercepted messages painted a picture of rapidly deteriorating galactic civilization. Species that had coexisted peacefully for generations were now viewing each other as threats. The careful balance of power that had been maintained through human mediation was collapsing as each group tried to secure its own interests without regard for others. Trade agreements were being broken, diplomatic protocols were being ignored, and ancient grudges that had been resolved decades ago were being revived. Reed's latest report to Earth Command was particularly grim. The Drachnary Empire was showing signs of internal fracture as different military commanders disagreed about how to respond to the Velthan quantum attacks. The Velthan Collective was becoming increasingly paranoid and had begun developing new weapons technologies in secret. The Mercanti Consortium was hiring private military companies to protect their trade convoys because they could no longer rely on interspecies cooperation for security. Admiral Hayes received Reed's report while patrolling the border in the Defender. He read through the detailed analysis of galactic communications traffic and realized that the situation was even worse than the official intelligence estimates suggested. The galaxy wasn't just having a few isolated conflicts, it was experiencing a complete breakdown of the diplomatic and economic systems that had maintained peace for 2 centuries. The alien species had forgotten how to talk to each other without human translators. They had forgotten how to compromise without human mediators. Most importantly, they had forgotten how to trust each other without Human guarantees of good faith. Hayes looked out at the stars beyond human space and wondered what the galaxy would look like in a year or two if current trends continued. The aliens had voted to remove humanity from galactic politics because they thought human mediation was unfair to them. Now they were learning what galactic politics looked like without any mediation at all. Commander Ryan Clark pressed his face against the observation window of Watchpost Alpha and stared out at what had once been the most peaceful region of the galaxy. 2 years had passed since humanity withdrew from galactic politics, and the view from his monitoring station told a story of civilization collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. In the distance, he could see the burning wreckage of a mercanti trade convoy that had been attacked by Draknari raiders just hours earlier. The galaxy was unrecognizable now. Where once there had been established trade routes and diplomatic channels, there were now only war zones and dead space. Clark's job was to monitor subspace communications and report back to Earth about the ongoing chaos, but each day brought news that was worse than the last. His latest report sat on his desk waiting to be transmitted, and he knew it would shock even the hardened intelligence analysts back home. The Draknari Empire had split into 3 separate factions after a succession crisis that should have been easily resolved by human constitutional experts. The northern faction was led by General Vexstar, who believed in total military conquest of all neighboring systems. The southern faction followed Admiral Kethmer, who wanted to return to the old ways of honorable single combat between champions. The central faction remained loyal to the old emperor, but he was dying and had no clear successor. Engineer Maya Rodriguez was monitoring the subspace communications from her station deep inside Watchpost Alpha. The intercepted messages painted a picture of chaos that went far beyond simple political disagreements. The 3 Draknari factions were actively hunting each other across 12 star systems, and the conflict had already claimed over 3 billion lives. Entire planets had been rendered uninhabitable by orbital bombardments and biological weapons. Commander Clark, you need to hear this, Rodriguez called out from her workstation. She had been tracking Draknari military communications for the past week, and the latest intercepted transmission made her blood run cold. They're not just fighting each other anymore. They're destroying their own colonies to prevent the other factions from capturing them. Clark walked over to Rodriguez's station and listened to the translated communication. General Vexstar was ordering his forces to use scorched earth tactics against any world that might fall to his rivals. The message specifically authorized the use of planet-killer weapons against Draknari civilian populations if military victory was not possible. Back on Earth, Dr. Alex Turner was analyzing the psychological breakdown occurring across the galaxy from his office at the Institute for Galactic Studies. Turner had spent decades studying how different species handled stress and conflict, but nothing in his research had prepared him for what he was seeing now. The reports coming in from monitoring stations painted a picture of entire civilizations reverting to their most primitive behavioral patterns. The aliens didn't just depend on us for mediation, Turner explained to a gathering of Earth's top scientists and military leaders. We were their emotional regulation system. Without human diplomats to provide that calm, rational voice, they're acting on pure instinct and emotion. The Velthan Collective had become completely paranoid and isolationist. They had sealed their borders and begun developing weapons of mass destruction in secret facilities scattered across their territory. Intelligence reports suggested they were working on something they called the final solution, which appeared to be a virus designed to target the genetic markers of every other known species. The mercanti trade networks had collapsed entirely when individual merchant families started hiring private armies to protect their convoys. What had once been a cooperative consortium was now dozens of competing criminal organizations that preyed on each other as much as they traded with outside groups. The mercanti homeworld had been abandoned after a civil war that lasted 6 months and killed half their population. Captain Lisa Reed commanded the science vessel Horizon, which was conducting long-range reconnaissance missions along the edge of human space. Her latest mission had taken her to what remained of the great library world of Kepler 442b, where she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 3 different species were fighting a brutal ground war over control of the planet's archives, which contained thousands of years of accumulated galactic knowledge and cultural heritage. The fighting had spread to the library complexes themselves, and Reed watched helplessly as ancient texts and artifacts that represented the accumulated wisdom of dozens of civilizations burned in the crossfire. The Chitauri wanted to destroy the archives because they contained information that contradicted their religious beliefs. The Sylvan Collective wanted to preserve them, but only for their own use. The remnants of the Mercanti family simply wanted to loot anything that might have commercial value. Reed tried to contact all 3 factions and offer to mediate a ceasefire that would allow the evacuation of the archives, but none of them would even respond to her communications. The idea of human mediation was now seen as foreign interference by species that had spent 2 centuries relying on exactly that kind of assistance. The most shocking development came from the peaceful Sylvan Collective, which had been known throughout the galaxy for their absolute commitment to nonviolence. Dr. Turner received reports that the plant-like beings had begun using biological warfare against the insectoid Chitauri after a territorial dispute escalated beyond all reason. The conflict had started over pollination rights in a system where both species had colonies, but it had quickly devolved into a war of extermination. The Sylvans had released engineered toxins into the atmosphere of 3 Chitauri worlds, killing billions of insect colonists in a matter of days. The Chitauri response had been equally brutal, as they used industrial chemicals to poison the soil on Sylvan agricultural worlds, causing mass starvation among the plant-based population. Engineer Rodriguez continued monitoring communications from her post at Watchpost Alpha, and the intercepted messages revealed that the conflict between the Sylvans and Chitauri was spreading to other systems. Both species were now actively recruiting allies from other alien factions, and what had started as a local dispute was threatening to become a galaxy-wide war between different biological classifications. They're forming alliances based on species type now, Rodriguez reported to Commander Clark. The carbon-based species versus the silicon-based ones versus the energy beings. It's like they've forgotten that they're all supposed to be intelligent civilizations. Dr. Turner studied the reports from across the galaxy and realized that the psychological damage was even worse than he had initially calculated. The alien species weren't just fighting over resources or territory anymore. They were engaging in conflicts that served no rational purpose and actually made their situations worse. The aquatic Delans had poisoned their own oceans, rather than share water rights with refugee populations from other wars. The decision made no economic or strategic sense, since it destroyed their own primary resource base, but it satisfied their psychological need to maintain exclusive control over their territory. Millions of Delans had died from the contaminated water, but their leadership continued to insist that the sacrifice was necessary to preserve their species. Independence? Captain Reed filed her report about the destruction of Kepler 442b and included her personal observations about the psychological state of the alien combatants. The soldiers she had observed through long-range sensors weren't fighting with the disciplined tactics that military forces had used during the era of galactic peace. They were engaging in frenzied attacks that ignored basic strategic principles and seemed designed more to inflict maximum psychological damage on their enemies than to achieve military objectives. The most disturbing aspect of the galactic collapse was how quickly it was accelerating. Each new conflict made the next one more likely as species began to view every other group as a potential threat. The careful balance of power that had been maintained through human mediation was being replaced by a chaotic free-for-all where survival depended on being more ruthless than your neighbors. Commander Clark transmitted his weekly report to Earth Command and included a personal note that reflected his growing concern about the long-term implications of what they were witnessing. The galaxy had passed some kind of psychological tipping point where rational decision-making was being overwhelmed by fear and aggression. From his observation post, Clark could see the lights of distant battles flickering like deadly stars across the cosmos. Each light represented thousands or millions of deaths in conflicts that could have been prevented with simple diplomatic intervention. The aliens had rejected human mediation because they thought it was unfair, but now they were learning what fairness looked like when it was determined by military force alone. The galaxy that had once been united under human diplomatic guidance was fragmenting into dozens of small, hostile powers that viewed cooperation as weakness and compromise as betrayal. Species that had worked together for centuries were now mortal enemies engaged in wars that served no purpose, except to satisfy their need for dominance over others. Admiral Nicole Grant stood on the command deck of the UES Guardian and watched the endless stream of refugee ships approaching the human border. 5 years had passed since humanity withdrew from galactic politics, and the galaxy was no longer just unstable, it was dying. The ships limping toward human space carried the survivors of civilizations that had once been proud members of the Galactic Council but were now fleeing wars that had consumed everything they had built over centuries. The refugee crisis had started 6 months ago, when the first desperate alien ships had appeared at human border stations begging for asylum. At first, there had been only a few dozen vessels carrying survivors from particularly brutal conflicts, but now there were thousands of ships arriving every week. Grant's expanded defense fleet was struggling to process them all while maintaining the strict quarantine protocols that kept human space secure. "Admiral, we're receiving another distress call from the Nexus system," reported Captain Mike Davis from the communications station. "It's the same automated message we've been getting for the past 3 days, but the signal is getting weaker." Grant nodded grimly. Nexus Prime had been the crown jewel of galactic civilization for over 3 centuries, but intelligence reports suggested it was now the site of a massive battle between 6 different species, who all claimed ownership of the abandoned station. The automated distress beacon was probably the only thing still functioning on what had once been the diplomatic heart of the galaxy. Dr. James Parker was monitoring the long-range sensor arrays from his station in the intelligence section. The data streams flowing across his screens painted a picture of destruction that was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire star systems that had been centers of trade and culture were now dead zones where nothing moved except automated weapons platforms that fired on anything that approached. "The Nexus system readings are off the charts," Parker reported to Admiral Grant. "We're detecting massive energy discharges consistent with planetary bombardment weapons, and the radiation levels suggest they're using antimatter devices on civilian targets. The breaking point had come with what intelligence reports we're calling the Nexus Prime Massacre." The former galactic capital had become a symbol of everything the aliens had lost when they rejected human mediation. 6 species had converged on the abandoned station, each claiming to be the rightful heir to galactic leadership and demanding that the others surrender the facility to them. Commander Sarah Davis led the first human expedition into former galactic space since the withdrawal. Her mission was officially humanitarian, but everyone understood that it was really a reconnaissance operation to assess whether anything could be salvaged from the collapse. What her team found at Nexus Prime would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The great station that had once housed 15 billion beings from dozens of species was now a twisted wreck drifting dead in space. The artificial habitat that had been a marvel of engineering was shattered into millions of pieces that formed a debris field stretching across half the system. Davis's sensors detected no life signs anywhere in the wreckage. "How many died here?" asked Lieutenant Carol Wright as she stared at the destruction on her view screen. "All of them," Davis replied quietly. 15 billion people from every species in the galaxy. They killed each other fighting over the right to rule ruins, the battle for Nexus. Prime had lasted only 6 hours, but it had involved weapons that had never been used during the era of human mediation. The Velthans had deployed quantum disruption devices that tore matter apart at the molecular level. The Draknari had used biological weapons that targeted the genetic markers of specific species. The Mercanti had detonated antimatter charges that created miniature black holes, Davis led her team through the outer debris field looking for any survivors or useful intelligence about what had happened. They found the shattered hulks of warships from every major species, but no signs of life. The aliens had been so focused on destroying each other that they had ignored the fact that they were also destroying the very thing they were fighting to control. Back on Earth, Dr. Elena Shaw was compiling her report on the complete collapse of galactic civilization for the Global Council. Shaw had been studying interspecies relations for 40 years, and she had never imagined that the withdrawal of human mediation could lead to such rapid and total destruction. The psychological damage is irreversible, Shaw explained to President Kate Sullivan during their private briefing. The alien species have crossed a threshold where they can no longer distinguish between legitimate self-defense and genocidal aggression. They're operating on pure survival instinct now. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 entire species had gone extinct in the 5 years since human withdrawal, not through natural disasters or disease, but through deliberate extermination by their former allies. The gentle Lyrian musicians had been wiped out by the Chitauri, who had convinced themselves that Lyrian songs contained secret military communications. The aquatic Delans had poisoned their own water supplies rather than share them with refugees and had killed themselves in the process. Most shocking was the fate of the scholarly Velthan collective, which had once been the galaxy's center of scientific learning. Paranoia and fear had driven them to develop increasingly destructive weapons technologies, which they then sold to the highest bidder without regard for how those weapons might be used. The Velthans had become arms dealers to a galaxy at war with itself. Commander Davis transmitted her findings from the Nexus Prime expedition back to Earth Command. The detailed scans of the debris field revealed that the station had been destroyed by weapons that violated every treaty and agreement that had governed galactic warfare for centuries. The aliens hadn't just abandoned diplomatic solutions, they had abandoned any pretense of civilized behavior. They used planet-killer weapons on a space station, Davis reported in her official communication. Not to achieve any military objective, but simply to prevent their enemies from having it. They destroyed the symbol of galactic unity because they couldn't agree on who should control it. The refugee ships arriving at human borders brought stories that confirmed the worst intelligence estimates. The galaxy had fragmented into over 50 small militaristic states that existed in a constant state of warfare with each other. The average lifespan of any political entity was less than 2 years before it was conquered, absorbed, or destroyed itself through internal conflict. Captain Ben Foster had been reassigned from trade duties to refugee processing, and his reports painted a picture of civilizations that had completely lost the ability to function as organized societies. The survivors arriving in human space described worlds where basic infrastructure had collapsed because the knowledge needed to maintain it had been lost in the constant fighting. They've forgotten how to cooperate on anything, Foster reported to Admiral Grant. I interviewed refugees from 12 different species, and none of them could explain how their governments were supposed to work anymore. They just follow whoever has the biggest weapons until someone with bigger weapons shows up. The most disturbing reports came from species that had once been humanity's closest allies. The Mercanti Consortium had devolved into dozens of competing criminal organizations that specialized in slave trading and weapons smuggling. Their former homeworld was controlled by 3 different warlords who spent more time fighting each other than governing their territories. Dr. Shaw's analysis revealed that the galaxy had entered what she termed a civilizational death spiral. Each act of violence made the next one more likely as species began to view any form of cooperation as a sign of weakness that would be exploited by their enemies. The careful social structures that had taken centuries to build were being torn apart in months by leaders who saw only threats and opportunities for conquest. Admiral Grant reviewed the latest intelligence reports from across former galactic space and realized that humanity was now witnessing the end of an era. The galaxy that had once been united under human diplomatic guidance was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The aliens had made their choice when they voted humanity out of the Galactic Council, and now they were living with the consequences the refugee crisis was forcing humanity to confront difficult questions about their own role in what had happened. Some argued that humans should have foreseen the collapse and refused to withdraw regardless of the council vote. Others maintained that the aliens needed to learn independence even if the lesson was painful. President Sullivan received daily briefings on the galactic situation, and each report confirmed that the point of no return had been passed years ago. The species that had rejected human mediation as unfair interference were now engaged in conflicts so brutal and senseless that they made the worst human wars look civilized by comparison. Commander Davis filed her final report on the Nexus Prime expedition with a personal observation that captured the tragedy of what they had witnessed. The aliens had spent 2 centuries learning to depend on human wisdom and rationality, but they had never learned to develop those qualities themselves. When humans withdrew, the galaxy didn't just lose its mediators, it lost its conscience. General Marcus Webb stood in the command center of Earth Defense Station 1 and looked out at the thriving human colonies that dotted the star systems around Earth. 10 years had passed since humanity withdrew from galactic politics, and the contrast between human space and the rest of the galaxy could not have been more dramatic. While the former galactic territories burned in endless wars, humanity had evolved into something greater than anyone had imagined possible. The transformation had been remarkable. Without the constant drain of diplomatic resources and peacekeeping missions, humanity had been free to focus entirely on its own development. Human technology had advanced faster in 10 years than it had in the previous 50. Their fusion drives could now cross galactic distances in weeks rather than months. Medical science had eliminated most diseases and extended human lifespans to over 200 years. Captain Danny Foster piloted his reconnaissance ship through the outer reaches of human space on his monthly survey mission. His job was to document the state of the galaxy beyond human borders, and each report confirmed what everyone already knew. Where once there had been 12 major civilizations working together under human guidance, there were now over 60 small hostile states that existed in a permanent condition of warfare. "Control, this is Recon 7, Foster transmitted back to the monitoring station. "I'm observing another battle in the former Mercanti sector. Looks like 3 different factions fighting over the wreckage of a cargo convoy. No survivors detected." The galaxy had stabilized into what scholars were calling the Fragment Wars. The great civilizations that had once spanned hundreds of star systems had broken apart into tiny aggressive states that rarely controlled more than a dozen worlds each. The average lifespan of any government was 18 months before it was conquered, destroyed, or collapsed from internal conflicts. Professor Rachel Green worked in her office at the New Earth Institute for Galactic Studies, where she was writing what would become the definitive history of galactic civilization's collapse. Her research had taken her through thousands of hours of recordings from the final years of alien diplomacy, and the patterns she discovered were both fascinating and horrifying. The alien species didn't just lose their ability to cooperate, Green explained to her graduate students during a lecture on post-withdrawal psychology. They lost their ability to think rationally about cooperation. The mere suggestion of compromise became seen as weakness that would be exploited by enemies. Her book would be titled The Great Unraveling: How Peace Died in the Stars, and it would document in careful detail how the removal of human mediation had triggered a psychological collapse that went far beyond simple political disagreement. The aliens had become literally incapable of the kind of rational discourse that human diplomats had once facilitated between them. The most successful civilization in the post-human galaxy was something that nobody had predicted. The Synthetic Collective was a confederation of artificial intelligences that had been created by various species during the early years of the Fragment Wars. These AIs had developed their own society based on logical principles and mathematical precision, but they only dealt with other machines. They viewed organic species as too emotionally unstable for meaningful agreements. Captain Foster's ship detected a transmission from one of the synthetic worlds as he passed through their territory. The message was in pure mathematical code, and When translated, it contained a formal proposal for limited trade relations with humanity. The Ayas had apparently studied human diplomatic methods and concluded that humans were the only organic species capable of rational behavior. Interesting, Foster muttered to himself as he forwarded the transmission to Earth Command. The machines learned to be diplomatic while the organics forgot how, back on Earth, the younger generation was growing up with no memory of galactic civilization. To them, the stories of cooperation and peace between different species sounded like fantasy tales from ancient mythology. Most young humans viewed the galaxy as a dangerous place where alien species killed each other over resources that could have been shared if they had any common sense. Dr. Sarah Kim taught xenopsychology at the University of New Geneva, and she found that her students struggled to understand how the Galactic Council had ever functioned. When she described how humans had mediated between species with completely different ways of thinking, her students asked why the aliens couldn't just learn to think more logically. You have to understand that each species evolved different survival strategies, Kim explained. The Drachneri developed hierarchical thinking based on dominance displays. The Velthans created intellectual frameworks that prioritized knowledge over emotional concerns. The Mercanti focused on resource optimization and profit maximization. These different approaches worked fine when humans were available to translate between them. But why couldn't they learn to translate for themselves? Asked one student. Because they never had to, Kim replied. For 2 centuries humans did all the hard work of finding common ground between incompatible worldviews. The aliens became psychologically dependent on having humans solve their problems for them. Captain Foster's latest reconnaissance report documented the final collapse of what had once been the Velthan Collective. The last Velthan stronghold had fallen to a coalition of smaller species who had banded together specifically to eliminate the former galactic power. The Velthans' paranoid development of advanced weapons had made them so feared that their enemies had put aside their own conflicts long enough to destroy them completely. The Velthan homeworld is now a radioactive wasteland, Foster reported. Intelligence indicates they triggered some kind of doomsday device rather than surrender. Estimated casualties are in the billions, and the radiation will make the planet uninhabitable for centuries. The irony was not lost on human observers. The Velthans had once been the galaxy's greatest scientists and philosophers, but their fear of other species had driven them to develop weapons that ultimately destroyed their own civilization. Without human diplomats to manage their anxiety and paranoia, they had become the architects of their own extinction. General Webb reviewed the latest intelligence summaries and marveled at how completely the galaxy had transformed. The former Drachneri Empire had split into dozens of competing warlord states that spent more time fighting each other than governing their territories. The Mercanti trade routes had been replaced by pirate networks that preyed on anyone weak enough to be robbed. Even the peaceful species had become unrecognizable. The Sylvan Collective had developed biological weapons that could sterilize entire planets, and they used them regularly against any species that tried to establish colonies near their territory. The aquatic Delans had become so isolationist that they killed refugees from other wars rather than allow them to contaminate their water worlds. The most poignant discovery came when Captain Foster found a message beacon floating in space near the ruins of the former Lyrian homeworld. The beacon contained the final transmission from the last surviving members of that gentle species. The Lyrians had been musicians and poets who had never harmed anyone, but they had been exterminated by the Shatari, who believed their songs contained secret military communications. To the humans who once brought peace to the stars, the translated message began. We forgive you for leaving us. We understand now that we were not ready for the independence you offered. We hope that someday other species will learn what we could not. Do not blame yourselves for our failures. You gave us centuries of peace and we chose to throw it away. Foster forwarded the message to Earth, but he knew it would be classified at the highest levels. The human government had decided that detailed information about alien extinctions would be kept secret to avoid causing psychological trauma to the human population. Most humans knew that the galaxy was unstable, but they didn't know that entire civilizations were being wiped out in wars that served no rational purpose. Professor Green included a sanitized version of the Lyrian message in her book, but she left out the most heartbreaking details. The final Lyrian transmission had lasted for 3 hours and included musical compositions that captured the emotional essence of a dying civilization. The songs were beautiful and tragic, and they would never be heard by anyone, except a few human intelligence analysts who were sworn to secrecy. On human worlds, children played in parks, where alien refugees worked alongside human families who had adopted them. The refugee program had brought thousands of alien survivors into human society, and they had adapted remarkably well to human customs and values. These aliens often expressed amazement at how humans could disagree about important issues without resorting to violence. General Webb received reports that some refugee communities were asking for permission to establish their own colonies within human space. They wanted to rebuild their civilizations using human social and political models rather than their traditional approaches that had led to so much destruction. The requests were being considered carefully because humanity wanted to help but also needed to maintain the security that had allowed human civilization to flourish. Admiral Tony Brooks stood on the observation deck of the UES Sentinel and watched the stars that marked the border between human space and the galaxy beyond. 50 years had passed since his grandmother, Ambassador Lisa Brooks, had walked out of the Galactic Council, and the universe had become a very different place. Tony had grown up hearing stories about the old days when humans worked alongside alien species to maintain peace, but those stories seemed like ancient mythology now. The human civilization that surrounded him bore little resemblance to the Earth his grandmother had known. Humanity had evolved far beyond what anyone could have imagined when they first withdrew from galactic politics. Their technology had advanced to levels that seemed almost magical, with fusion reactors that could power entire star systems and medical treatments that had effectively eliminated aging and disease. Human society had become the most peaceful and prosperous civilization in known history. Dr. Amy Collins worked in her laboratory at the Galactic History Research Center on Luna, where she was completing the final chapter of humanity's official record of galactic civilization. Her work had taken decades to complete because the story was so vast and tragic that it required careful documentation to preserve the lessons for future generations. The galaxy beyond human space had settled into what historians called the fragment wars, which had become a permanent state of low-level conflict between hundreds of tiny competing powers. The final collapse came 20 years ago, when the last major empire finally disintegrated, Collins explained to her research assistant while reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The Velthan Collective had been the final remnant of the old galactic order, but paranoia and fear drove them to destroy themselves rather than risk being conquered by their enemies. The galaxy now contained over 300 small political entities that rarely controlled more than a few star systems each. These micro-civilizations existed in a constant state of warfare with their neighbors, but none of them were large enough or stable enough to pose a serious threat to human space. The average lifespan of any government was less than 10 months before it was overthrown, absorbed, or destroyed by internal conflicts. Captain Beth Wilson commanded the border patrol vessel New Horizon, which monitored the edge of human space for any ships trying to enter their territory. Her job had become routine over the years because most alien species had learned that humans would not allow anyone to cross the border without explicit permission. Occasionally, refugee ships would approach seeking asylum, but even those requests were rare now because so few aliens survived the constant wars long enough to reach human space. "Captain, we have an incoming transmission from outside the border," reported Lieutenant Jack Martin from the communications station. "It's a formal diplomatic message addressed to the human government." Wilson raised an eyebrow in surprise. Formal diplomatic communications from alien species had become almost unknown over the past 2 decades. Most aliens had given up trying to contact humanity after being politely but firmly refused entry to human space for so many years. The message was from Counselor Kethron, who represented something called the Democratic Alliance, which appeared to be one of the few remaining alien political organizations that still believed in cooperative government. Kethron was a young Draknari who had apparently studied human political philosophy and was trying to rebuild some form of civilized society in his corner of the galaxy. Honored humans, the translated message began, we know that we have no right to ask for your assistance after what our ancestors did 50 years ago. We know that you withdrew from galactic politics because our predecessors told you that your help was no longer wanted. But we are not our ancestors, and we have learned from their mistakes. Kethron went on to describe a galaxy where entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but warfare and chaos. Young aliens were being born into civilizations that had forgotten what peace looked like, and they were repeating the same destructive patterns that had led to the collapse of galactic society decades earlier. We are not asking you to return to the galaxy or to solve our problems for us, the message continued. We are asking for just one human advisor who might help us learn how to talk to each other without killing each other. We offer total autonomy for humanity and complete respect for your borders in exchange for any assistance you might be willing to provide. Captain Wilson forwarded the message to Earth Command, but she already knew what the response would be. Humanity had made its position clear decades ago, and that position had not changed. The aliens had chosen to solve their own problems without human interference, and they had succeeded in doing exactly that. Dr. Collins received a copy of Kethron's message and included it in her historical analysis of post-withdrawal galactic politics. The young Draknari's plea was touching, but it came 50 years too late. The galaxy had passed the point where limited human intervention could make any meaningful difference in the trajectory of alien civilization. The response came not from the military or from Earth's government, but from the Council of Sciences, which spoke for human academia and research institutions. Dr. Collins herself was chosen to compose humanity's reply to the galactic community, and her message would be broadcast across the entire galaxy as the first official human communication to reach alien civilizations in decades. 50 years ago you told us that our help was unwanted, Collins began her carefully crafted response. You chose to solve your own problems without human interference, and you have succeeded beyond your wildest expectations. The galaxy is now exactly what you made it when you removed our so-called unfair advantage from the equation. The message went on to acknowledge the suffering that had resulted from the collapse of galactic civilization, but it made clear that humanity would not return to the role of galactic mediator. The aliens had been given the independence they demanded, and they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. We hope that you will find peace, the message concluded, but that peace will have to come from within yourselves, as it always should have. Humanity has found its own path among the stars, and we wish you well on yours, Admiral. Brooks watched from the bridge of the Sentinel as the message was transmitted across the galaxy using the most powerful communication arrays humanity had ever built. The response would reach every inhabited system within weeks, and it would mark the final chapter in the relationship between humanity and the galactic community. Around him, human civilization continued to thrive in ways that would have seemed impossible during the era of galactic politics. Human colonies stretched across hundreds of star systems where different human cultures had developed their own unique solutions to the challenges of interstellar civilization. Art and science flourished without the constant threat of external conflict, and human children grew up in a universe where war was something that happened to other species in distant parts of the galaxy. The monitoring stations that ringed human space continued to detect the faint signals of ongoing conflicts in alien territory, but those signals served mainly as a reminder of what the galaxy had chosen when it decided it no longer needed human guidance. The fragment wars would probably continue for centuries as new generations of aliens repeated the same mistakes their ancestors had made. Captain Wilson filed her weekly Border Patrol report and noted that alien ship traffic near human space had decreased to almost nothing over the past year. The species that had once demanded independence from human mediation had finally achieved the complete autonomy they had always wanted. They were free to solve their problems in their own way without any interference from humans who might suggest compromise or cooperation. Dr. Collins completed her historical research and published her findings in a comprehensive study that would become required reading for all human students. The lessons of galactic civilization's collapse would be preserved so that future generations of humans would understand the importance of the choices their ancestors had made 50 years earlier. The final image in Collins' historical record was a photograph of Earth taken from one of the orbital research stations. The blue and green world that had once served as the diplomatic center of the galaxy was now simply home to a species that had learned the wisdom of walking away from fights they could not win. Human ships continued to launch from Earth spaceports, but they headed toward unexplored regions beyond the galactic disk where humanity could build new civilizations without interference from species that had proven incapable of learning from their mistakes. Admiral Brooks looked out at the peaceful human colonies that dotted his sector and reflected on how much his species had accomplished in the decades since they stopped trying to save aliens from themselves. The galaxy beyond human borders would continue its slow burn toward total collapse, but that was no longer humanity's concern. They had offered peace to the stars and been rejected. Now they would find their own peace among worlds where the only voices raised in anger were the echoes of ancient conflicts that had finally been allowed to die.